Juan Perón has taken the oath of office as president of Argentina. His return to power is expected to mean a crackdown on left-wing guerrillas. President Nixon is expected to veto a bill approved by Congress that would limit his powers to maintain combat forces overseas. The hour's lead story: all signs point to an intensive investigation, but probable confirmation of Gerald Ford as vice president. Robert Lazich, NBC News.
You're on the Night Watch with WIOD. Call 759-4311 in Dade, 584-7117 in Broward. Now, here's WIOD's Art Merrill.
My guest this morning is the fascinating, interesting, and erudite Don John Ross from the WIOD news staff. All right, let's get back to the order of events.
Let me just throw in this word about Frank Lloyd Wright while I think of it, because I'll forget it otherwise, because it's not part of the sequence. I was interviewing him one time, and this was a television interview. And at one point I said to him, now, speaking as an expert in architecture, and at that point he got up, and he said, I didn't come here to be insulted. And I said, I'm sorry, what did I say? He said, you called me an expert. And I said, is there something wrong with that? He said, if anybody ever calls you an expert, remember what it means. And I said, what does it mean? He said, it means you've stopped learning.
That's interesting.
Isn't it?
I don't buy it, but it's
no,
interesting.
I see his point, though.
He's got a point, but
that
I don't
an expert is someone who feels he has reached the end, of the road. There is nothing more
but
to grasp.
Also, what about the person who knows why you're asking a question or what you have in mind for the purpose of gaining information that he might be able to impart, and then uses the opportunity to become a sophist again,
well, you see,
which is what he's doing. Really.
Oh, sure. That's what made him interesting to me. Yeah. You see, because I was interested in what it was, what his angst was, what pushed him. And I still don't know all the answers to that.
Well, Don, we left you on the floor of an apartment building.
That's right, in Kensington
talking
Gardens.
To
Roger Toohey,
who had just shaken your hand. And said, I went into crime because I thought it was a good business.
That's right, very profitable.
Working for Marshall Fields is one of two newsmen on a radio station. The other one being Mike Wallace. What happened then?
Well, that was about the extent of the interview. I have briefed it down. The thing took probably about 17 minutes. But this really just did everything in the world for me, because I not only made front page news in Chicago, in the Chicago Sun, naturally, they ran verbatim, everything that had been done, everything that had been said, plus the national news wires, plus, just everything, including a request from the BBC for a rebroadcast of the thing, and
Could you tell me the year of this, by the way?
This was 1942.
Did we have tape in 42?
No, we had discs.
Was it transcribed?
Discs.
Had they transcribed the report? So there was a recording of it?
There was a recording of it, thank goodness.
Yeah.
And overnight, I became a kind of a minor celebrity,
This is almost similar to the fellow who did the Hindenburg thing. Unknown until that happened, and then, of course, became very well known. Or what's his name who did the Kennedy assassination in California?
Yeah.
I forget his name at the moment.
Herb Belair.
Yeah. But overnight, everybody knew who he was.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. So what happened then?
Well, then I was prepared to enjoy the fruits of my success. And for about 6 months after that, I did enjoy tremendous fruits of success. I was appearing on network shows, on all these panel shows, Meet the Press type things. Meet the Press didn't exist at that time, but Theodore Granick did have a show of a similar nature, and I can't remember the name of it now, and I became known as one of the inquisitorial reporters. I was the one who was placed on the panel to grill the person, to move in, you see, with that little sneaky question that would be the crusher. And even though this is out of sequence, this is a kind of an important little item. I can't mention this politician's name, but this man was running for public office. And in the course of the interview, apparently all the questions had run dry, and we were just, floundering. So just for the heck of it, and as is consistent with my rather twisted humor pattern and personality, I said to him, "Sir, could you tell me what you feel about the Baldwin buttermilk tax bill?" So he went on for about 15 minutes talking about the Baldwin buttermilk tax bill and how in his state that was primarily a dairy state, untrue. Secondly, that it was wrong to tax buttermilk, and various other things. There was only one thing that was wrong with the whole thing. There is no Baldwin buttermilk tax bill, and there never has been. And that man has me on his list now. And
how many people in the audience recognize the purpose of your question, do you think? 10%? 5%?
I don't know, but unfortunately the newspapers recognize the purpose of it, and they mentioned it in their editorial columns. I don't think we would have had any trouble if it hadn't been for that. But they pointed out, you see, what I had done. I intended just to do this and let it go by and let people draw their own conclusions at home. But unfortunately, the newspapers explained the joke.
Do you think when a senator is asked a question, as one was asked tonight on NBC television following the president's address, what do you think of the nomination of Representative Gerald Ford? And the answer came out sort of like, the Senate will see that the work is done expeditiously, and blah, blah, da, 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 and what's good for, da, da. Never having answered the question. Do you think people notice that?
Half of me says they do, and the other half says they don't, because I have a fixed prejudice. I feel that there are two kinds of interviews that people really never hear. That's the sports interview and the interview with the politician. Have you ever noticed they always say, "Coach Feinschreiber, what do you think about your chances next Saturday?" And the guy goes, "Well, I think
get out there next weekend. We're going to beat them."
They all say the same thing. They've been saying the same thing since the beginning of time.
Right.
Yeah.
I have never heard anything that Morris has ever said, although he's a lovable, plump little S.D. Sackle of South Florida. And you want to pinch his cheeks, he's so cute. But I just don't hear a word.
I think people, the public, has been conditioned since the beginning of time to feel that a politician or a sports figure is just going to say, just a series of words.
And have they been conditioned to believe that they must say something, whether it means anything or not?
Right. Absolutely.
Is it the Emperor's New Clothes where they won't admit by saying, I don't know.
That's
I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, as a matter of fact...
Yeah, we're going to go out there and try to win the game. If we lose, we lose.
You've probably read some rather sharp comments made in either sports or political columns where someone has asked a politician or a sports figure a question, and he said, "I don't know," and it's a dumb question, and I'm not even going to go into it.
And they cut that out of the tape, or they throw that film away?
Well, and not only that, they attack him afterward. They say, "Now, this guy's a real dummy, this coach so-and-so, because when I asked him if he was going to use the triple T formation, he just said, I don't know what I'm going to use," which is the logical answer to give, because he doesn't know till he gets into the game what he's going to do. But he's always attacked because he didn't cooperate with the interviewer who wanted some kind of garbage from him, and the guy wouldn't give it to him.
Yeah. Okay, so you're now a hero in Chicago, which was a very good radio town back in those days. Fascinating radio town.
It was great because
wined and dined,
soap operas were going great, and I think I was on every soap opera I can think of. I'm on Road of Life, Backstage Wife, Mr. Keene, Tracer of Lost Persons, and I had a real swinging time playing all kinds of roles, except I did hit a terrible clinker. I was appearing on one night show, a really big show, and I can't even remember the name of it now, but it had to do with the war effort. And so I was playing a Japanese general interviewing, or rather grilling, this suspect, or this American who had been captured. And so he says, "No matter how much you torture me, I will not give you that information." And I say, "Oh, yes, you will."
Good,
do it. "I don't think you're going to..."
What?
You see, I started the conversation without the accent, and then suddenly switched.
Yeah.
And then another time, there was
On
a show...
second thought, I'm going to stab you with this knife.
Right.
You remember that one?
Yes. And another great experience I had, General Mills came out with a show called, what was it, The Living Word? Oh, anyway, this was a show in which the concept was that they were going to do a soap opera, but based on the Bible, the living story of the Bible. You know, just told just like a soap opera is. You know, regular episodes.
It wasn't the greatest story ever told, was it?
Oh no. This was just an afternoon serial.
Yeah.
And they were looking for a narrator, and about 600 of us auditioned for this, and it got down to 300, then 200, and then 100, and then 50, and then 20, and then 15, and then 10, and I was still in the running, and we were down finally to 2 of us. And by the way, the other one was Mike Wallace. And so the opening opens.
I can just see you dangling from the 79th Street Bridge, which had opened as you were crossing, and the other one will have been Mike Wallace.
That's right.
Okay, go ahead.
So what they do is open with a little biblical quotation, you know, and this organ music would surge up, and you'd say, "The stories of the Bible reverently portrayed, presented by General Mills," you know, and you had to really fake it down. Well, the opening biblical quotation that I was given, the organ music surges up, and it is this: "Blessed be he who shall lose his life for me, for he shall find it again." Simple enough. So we get on the air, and I say, "Blessed who he, who he has." And they said, "You know, we'd probably never use that quote again, but we can't take the chance." So you see, my life has been a series of misadventures, really. It has always failed to really reach any crescendo. It's mostly good for laughs, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. So soap operas and speaking tours, you're still on the air there.
Mm-hmm.
But I imagine the next step is that you get an opportunity to go network.
No, I got the opportunity to go network in a rather hard way, in that I think it was about a month and a half before I went into service, NBC offered me this big opportunity. I was to become the administrative assistant to Clifton Utley, who was Garrick Utley's father. And Clifton Utley had a commentary on NBC, and I would assist him in the preparation of this commentary and follow in the last 5 minutes with my own news, with my own capsule comments on the passing scene. They were not to be commentary. His was to be the commentary. I was to bring folks the hard news. So, you know, I thought, you know, the world had really opened up. I was on my way to the big time. And I was, but not in the way that I thought. Because, as I say, about a month and a half after that, I got a little letter in the mail one day from Uncle Sam. And he said, "We've been missing you. When are you going to show up at the induction center?" So I showed up and went into service, and like everyone else, was having a very difficult time finding any place in the service, you know, classified and just rumbling around. I was with an anti-aircraft artillery group in Massachusetts. We were sleeping in pup tents in January, February, and March out on Cape Cod, right on Wellfleet.
That's fun. Yes.
That's
yes.
Lovely out there. Well, I probably would still be in that outfit except for one thing. The commanding officer called me in one day, and he said, "Ross, I want you to fix them SCR 133s. And I said, "What are those?" And he said, "You don't know what an SCR 133 is?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't." And he said, "Well, sir, for your information, an SCR 143 is the best signal corps radio we've got." And I said, "Well, sir, that's news to me." He said, "Now, don't pretend you don't know about them things." And I said, "I am not pretending, sir. I don't know anything about the mechanical side of radio. Nothing. I have never even fixed a radio or taken a tube out." He said, "Well, Ross, I'm going to give you your chance to come clean and do the right thing. Sergeant Jackson is going to get in your tent with you tonight, and he is going to watch you there, and you can think it over overnight and decide whether you want to fix one of our radios or not. Well, they had this big plan. The Coast Artillery every night had to cap up the guns, put these steel caps over them, take out the auxiliary rammer shoe, connect the thigh bone to the leg bone and all this stuff, and in effect dismantle the gun for the night so it wouldn't go off by accident. Well, we had a real high-class outfit. I should have known that this was going to happen because the Navy had originally been flying our practice targets for us to fire at, and they refused to do it after we shot down 2 of their planes. Well, overnight, they had put the steel cap on the gun, all right, but they had not taken out the auxiliary rammer shoe or the leg bone and the thigh bone and all the other stuff, and it was loaded with live ammunition. And in the cold, as I understand it, the rammer shoe spring slipped down through the pelvis and into the clevis, and that fired the gun. The shell went up to the front and had no way of getting out. So it came out the back. And the next thing I knew, I was in the hospital with a large hole in my back. So then there was a question of, they're saying to me, "Now, young man, I know it breaks your heart, but we may have to let you out of service unless we can find a function for you in the service." And I said, "Well, sir, it is going to break my heart. There's no question about it. But if it's all the same to you, I'd just as soon, go back home, and tend to my own problems." And they said, "You might be paralyzed for life." And I said, "I'd rather be paralyzed for life at home than paralyzed for life, or even part of it, in here." But somehow, some clever man at the Pentagon, in riffling through the little classified, going through the little memo boxes, found my card and said, "This is the man we've been looking for." And so they equipped me with some steel splints and encased my body from head to toe in a steel casing, and they made me a war correspondent. And I went to Europe that way, on crutches, and went through several campaigns on crutches. As a matter of fact, I had just recovered. I was just starting to walk again, and I was healing up. And we landed in a town called Stolzheim. This is one night before the Battle of the Bulge. And the Remagen Bridge battle was to take place the next morning, and Stolzheim is about 4 miles away from Remagen Bridge. The whole area is lined with German troops. There are 3 of us, and we land in this area, and one man, whose name will remain embedded on my mind forever, named Schuldheck, said, "Look, when we go into this town, let me do the talking because I'm a linguist." I was only too glad. So we got into this town, and we rapped on the door of this farmhouse, and Schuldheck, when the door opened, said to the lady, "Sprachen Sie Deutsch, Fräulein?" And she said, "Yeah." And he said, "How's chances of borrowing a wheelbarrow?" Well, that was my second wound. So I'm back in the hospital again, this time under the tutelage of the Germans. And this probably seems unpatriotic and a terrible thing to say, but I had a real nice time in that German hospital. They treated me much, much better than the Americans did. Much, much better. I had better food. I had much finer conversations. As a matter of fact, the man in the bed next to me had been an SS officer and had been injured. And in the routine course of conversation one day, I discovered that he had been a disc jockey in Hackensack, New Jersey for a great number of years. But when the war broke out, decided that he ought to go back to his homeland and fight for his country. So, when the victorious Allied troops moved through, the unvictorious German hospital corps left the hospital and left us there. And we were picked up by...
You were liberated.
We were liberated,
yeah.
And so, but by this time I was walking fairly well, even though to this day I have no feeling in my right leg, and my back goes into spasms every once in a while, and I dance a strange jig and so on. But that's neither here nor there. But it gives me a certain salty air when someone says, "Were you wounded in the war, sir?" And I can say, "Yes, sir, I was." And I don't have to go into detail as to how, because it's too ludicrous. Well, that actually, though, did give me my chance to finally make the big networks, because it so happened that in and around the time of the Battle of the Bulge and the Remagen Bridge and later the Normandy landing, none of the networks had enough people deployed over there, and they had to count on many of us to be correspondents. So I was a correspondent for all the networks, really, in a sense. I couldn't keep up sometimes. I had to carry a slip of paper, so I'd remember which network I was reporting from or for.
In what form did you send back your reports? Were they taped, recorded, or live?
All three.
All three. They carried a lot of equipment in those days.
Oh, yeah.
Did you have an assistant with you? I know that would bring out a laugh, but there were times when the men carried around tons of heavy metal boxes with either shortwave radios or recorders, which were monsters in those days.
They were monsters. I had a wire recorder.
Yeah.
Which had, by the way, been appropriated from the Germans. We'd stolen it from them. It was an excellent recorder, though.
Mm-hmm.
Except when those things broke.
Yeah.
When the little wires broke.
The spool went all over the place.
Then you had to knit it up again somehow.
Yeah.
Well, a good many of most of our reports, of course, were recorded and fed back at a later time, at a more convenient listening time. Mm. And it also allowed the military to censor what we had written and what we were reporting.
These are the kind of reports that Morgan Beatty, for instance, would do in the morning on NBC. The World Today, and reports from our correspondents around the world. Come in, Amsterdam.
Right.
I said, come in, Amsterdam. Well, we'll have that Amsterdam report in just a moment. We'll switch to Bremerhaven. And that didn't come in either. And many a morning went like that.
And that, again, is a place in which my twisted mind came into focus again. And this I did not think of as humor at the time. I still do not. But I got into a great amount of trouble with the military because in one report I was to include, as anyone knows who listens to the war reports, if you remember during the Vietnam War action and so on, every day the Pentagon issues these things, a body count. They say 144 American troops were killed, 3,286 South Vietnamese. Well, one day in the report, in a briefing, I asked, how do you arrive at this body count? And they said, what do you mean, how do we arrive at the body count? I said, how do you arrive at the body count? And they said, what do you mean, how do we? And I said, we can go on like this all day. All I want to know is how come, how do you know so accurately? And they said, well, you know when you're out in the field. And I said, well, that's why I asked the question, because I've been through several battles now, and I haven't noticed anyone walking around with a pencil totting up how many are dead on our side and how many are dead on the other side. And they said, well, these are approximate figures. And I said, they're lies, are they not? And they said, well, we don't like to think of it that way. And I said, well, no, however you like to think of it, what is the truth? I mean, how can you arrive at a body count? How do you really know? Other than the personnel list afterward, I can see where if you have 150 men going into a battle and 60 come out, it's easy to subtract. But how do you know how many of the enemy died since you don't have their personnel list? And they said, well, we have our ways. They have never explained that to this day, to my satisfaction. And
did you run into much trouble with the handouts, the reports that they wanted you to file, rather than what you actually
nothing
saw?
But trouble.
Yeah.
Nothing but. That's why, actually, it, again, seems unpatriotic to say, but it's a fact, that's all. The military of any country in the world, including our own, since the beginning of time, we may say, has had to protect itself. It has to present the most positive story possible. And in order to do that, you've got to, if not twist a few figures, leave them out. Just drop certain issues. Don't discuss battles which were failures. Don't discuss tactical maneuvers which did not work, and so on. Because if you do it too much, I mean, you can throw in a few of these, but if you do it too much, the people at home will get the idea we're losing.
Much of the flack from correspondents during the Korean conflict and the Vietnam peacekeeping move were from reporters who were on the scene who were either not permitted to go up front and take a look for themselves,
right,
or who balked at the idea of repeating the press handouts from the commanders of the units. Would you say that since that time, of course you've been back here, that as you read these reports, that you look at them rather with a jaundiced eye?
Not only with a jaundiced eye, but I can even recognize the terminology. I can tell where they're deviating, because it's that obvious.
Would you suggest that we got very little of the truth in the reports?
I would suggest that, yes. I hate to say that, but I would suggest
Was this
that.
so also in the World War II? The same sort of thing?
Yes. Yes, very much.
It would appear to me that it was not that carefully worked out as it was later years.
It has now become very sophisticated.
I seem to get the feeling that during the Second World War, we were informed better as to where we were.
Oh, yes.
We constantly saw lines in the movie newsreels of where our forces were and theirs were, and how we were advancing or how we were pulling back. And we had a general idea of how the war was going. But throughout the Korean campaign and the Vietnam campaign, I had really no concept of what was going on.
Of course, in all fairness, one of the reasons for that is that neither the Korean nor the Vietnam campaign had the kind of, geographic logistics.
Well, there was no
World War
battlefield.
II. That's right.
Yeah.
In other words, it was easy during World War II to see the movement of troops because they moved in one direction or another in
along that
long distances.
I found it rather interesting that Walter Cronkite tonight stood up from his chair, went to a map on the wall with a piece of blue chalk in his hand, and actually drew lines on the map showing where the advance of the campaign in Israel is this evening, which was a return to the early days of World War II when correspondents used to do that. So the public had
He's been fighting to do that for years.
A graphic picture more than... I can tell you personally that every report I see from a war zone looks like every other report I've seen, with a tank going up front, wounded coming back down, a plane, a bomb, a smoke, and it's meaningless, I think, to the public to relay all this information. And yet, don't you find that, as a general rule, the wire services do nothing but that?
That's right. I would say so.
There isn't a broad geographical picture or a political picture of what the issues are.
And the reason for it, and I'm glad we're getting to this, because I know, there's no question that the people of the United States fear, that the news media is distorting, twisting, this, that, or the other thing. In point of fact, in this specific instance, and we'll go on to other instances that indicate something else a little bit later, in this specific instance, there is a kind of a boredom which sets in, and these people don't really know. They don't really know where the logistic areas are, and so they say the Negev, and they don't really know where the Negev is, and they figure nobody else knows either, and I don't think anybody cares, Now that's false.
Is it also?
But they really do get that concept.
During World War II, there was a supreme commander, it was Eisenhower. And there was a general overall objective, and we knew whether we were accomplishing it or we were not accomplishing it. In the wars that followed, and the campaigns that followed, nobody knew what the objectives were anywhere.
That's right.
We didn't know where we were fighting, where we were going. It sort of evolved later on, but the confusion was tremendous. I think it's starting to straighten itself out in the coverage of this Israeli thing.
Yes.
I think they finally learned their lesson that the public just doesn't understand all this.
That's
and it's meaningless.
And will tune out if they don't, get the answer.
Let us take the wire service copy here. Of course, the first top stories deal with the nomination of Representative Gerald Ford and the Mideast War. I might mention, let's count down now. This is only in the last couple of hours. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are items in the news. 6, 7. The Israeli war has gone now down to item 8 in the news. And I can say it says, have fought within 25 miles of the ancient capital of Syria, Damascus. In that few words that I've just read, some verbose writer is trying to impress me with the fact that it's an ancient capital
of Damascus.
And it's 25 miles. But Syria, while acknowledging some Israeli progress, claims Israel forces were forced to retreat late. It's meaningless to most people. And in every case, in every line that they write, they repeat all the information that has gone before in case there's some strange individual walking around who has not heard the news in about a year. You cannot say Agnew, Spiro Agnew, Mr. Agnew, or Vice President Agnew without saying the former Vice President who resigned day before yesterday in the heat of an indictment which, blah, 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 said today, and then you say, I'm quitting. This kind of reportage.
It's ridiculous.
It is words for the sake of words, isn't it?
Certainly it is. Because after all, quite honestly, if the news services, were to just cut it down to the bare bone, you'd probably get 5 sentences, and everyone, all the stations along the line say, boy, we're getting robbed here. You call this a 5-minute summary? Why, it only takes about 2 seconds to read this. Well, that's just about what it should take. That's one of the things that I like about our news department here and the way we approach news. We pare all these things down. We cut them down. We slash them to the point sometimes where we go too far.
I would say that I've heard you do the news in the afternoon, and I say, for God's sake, Don, you didn't. That's not a whole story. Tell me more. I talk to the radio. At night, though, we don't have the time, because we're busy, to pare this all down. And I get hung up with the words, and it depresses me.
Yeah.
I could probably read the first sentence of each item and have told you just as much as you need to know without any of the detail.
Have you ever noticed this, too? It'll say, well, let's take a specific example. A Fort Lauderdale man who invented the original cylindrical kite and lived to 155 years old and was the only man to ever see the sinking of Atlantis, passed away today.
At the age of 55.
At the age of 55. And you keep saying, who, you know?
Yes.
And they finally get to his name in the last sentence. Now, that's nonsense. If the man is that important, his name should start that story.
There is one wire service, I must say, which will write more readable copy than another, and we'll start an item with John Jones passed away today. He was known because he was the something or other.
That's good.
It is conversational.
And that's
it is geared toward radio broadcast. There are other wire services which are geared to press. And unfortunately, the newspapers suffer from this a great deal. They're still writing, I'm sure you'll agree.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is, of course, my own opinion. They're still writing for the world of 1935 in the newspapers today. With the I see the beautiful book laying there back there, the Associated Press style book, which is 1935. Let's be honest about it.
That's what it is.
And the old statement that the first paragraph of every news story must have the complete story, and then you go to the detail. I don't know why. None of the columnists write that way.
No.
None of the reporters write that way, but the newspaper writes that way, and the world doesn't want to read it that way. And they're missing a great deal. But getting back to World War II, you did experience the same problems we faced in getting the news at all.
Yes, very much
and
so.
Getting some sort of definitive picture of what was going on. In that experience, were you ever scared?
You mean scared of?
We had something on just a few moments ago, a
mean?
report from Israel. A man was doing a report, and then 5 MiGs flew in overhead, and he got, into the heat of battle. I'm sure it is a frightening experience to be reporting some. But I look at these television newsreel pictures, and I say to myself, everybody is aware of the man standing there with the microphone with the war going on behind him. And that, again, to me, is ludicrous as well.
It is.
I really don't need to look at him.
That's right.
They can't do a report from the White House unless the man is standing on the lawn with the lighted White House in the back, which gives it some kind of credence, some kind of authority, which he could just as well do in the studio. He didn't say anything more on the lawn. But the point I'm making is nobody says, what about that poor little slobby cameraman who is lugging a ton of equipment on his shoulder, being knocked about, and once in a while they catch a shot of some cameraman trying to cover this thing. You watch this man climb some alpine mountain, struggling to reach the top on the National Geographic. Did anybody say the cameraman got there first so they could show him coming up? He had to climb there too.
Right.
They forget that guy who carries the equipment. But you were going to say.
Oh, that brings me to something which is an allied point there, but goes off in a little different direction.
Yeah.
This is my big objection to television news. And now I have spent as much time in television news as I have in radio news. So it isn't a prejudice against the medium just because I'm not in it at this precise moment. But in the beginning, television news, you remember the Camel News Caravan? That was about the first big television news show. Well, they would open up in the very beginning with a shot of John Cameron Swayze, and he'd say good evening. And from that point onward, you didn't see John Cameron Swayze, you didn't see anybody except the people who were involved in the news.
It was the movie tone news with a narrator behind.
Yeah, and everybody made jokes about it, and they said it is the movie tone news with a narrator behind. But that's the way it's supposed to be.
Well, television is a visual medium. You don't have to look at Chancellor or Brinkley or anybody on the screen. What you want to see is what's happening in the world.
That's right.
Right.
And that has brought us to the stage now where we've got all these people making fun of, Mr. Agnew made fun, and many others, of the television reporter and the commentator, and talking about the twisted eyebrow and the lift of the eyebrow and the, editorializing by facial expression. In point of fact, it's just the opposite. Look at the people who are doing television news. Watch them. My wife made a great comment the other night. We were watching one television newscast, and the man had the little button in his ear, so he can get the instructions from the director. And my wife said, do you realize that there probably is no such person as John Jones? That's a wax figure? And that little button that's in his ear is feeding the audio into that wax head, and it's coming out the mouth because you could barely see the man's lips move, let alone any facial expression. So what we have today are television stations searching far and wide to get beautiful-looking young men whom as soon as you see them, as soon as they come up on the screen, have had no knowledge at all of news, do not know what they are reading, do not have the vaguest concept of what the importance is of the news, but they do look young, they look beautiful, and they have poker faces. Absolute poker faces. And this all exists on the station-to-station level, local stations. And yet, that same station, as soon as it completes its local news, where we've watched this zombie for half an hour, we go to the national news, and suddenly we see a whole bunch of gray-haired men. We see Walter Cronkite, and we see Howard K. Smith, and we see Harry Reasoner, none of whom fit that category at all. They're not young. They're not poker-faced. As a matter of fact,
they've been around since the year one.
That's right, and it shows,
Yeah.
and you can see it, and you believe in them because you know they've been there. They know what it's about.
Don, is it the rating business to make their newscast the most entertaining?
But what's entertaining about looking at a zombie?
Performance. How about the news team that sit there 4 or 5 abreast and have a laughable good time over? Say, we got a death in the news tonight. Been a lot of jokes about that, but I think it's a serious issue.
Yeah.
We have turned the world events into something to be laughed at.
Yeah. Well, I can't comment on that too much because, after all, I'm probably famous here for the fact that I twist everything in the morning to try to extract some humor out of it. So I can't go too far with that. But I would say this.
Well, there's a difference in radio and television.
Yes.
What you could do on a radio station immediately takes on a new connotation when it's seen.
When it's seen, yeah, I agree. And secondly, to automatically, here are these guys, and I again go back to this thing, and I realize this is a vicious attack. If here's a young man who is a zombie to start with. Now, he hasn't even developed enough personality yet to do the news straight. And suddenly you ask him to be a comic, too. Ask him to be a personality. So the best he can come up with is, well, Charlie, is it going to rain tonight? Am I going to get my petunias wet? And everybody falls all over the ground, and the cameramen go hysterical, and everybody shrieks and yells.
And they reinforce each other with laughter among the studio. That was very funny. I don't find it funny at home.
I don't either. And
I don't find it funny, for instance, when a guy goes out and says, we visited the home of the parents of the girl shot in St. Thomas. Was it St. Thomas or St. Croix?
St. Croix.
St. Croix. And she wasn't home, but she lives at such and such an address. And they show the front of the house and the mailbox and the number, and they advertise to everybody in town where she lives. And she's not home, but her car is parked out front. And the next day, thieves break in and burglarize the house. Because television has done her a grand favor by advertising everywhere where she lives. But she's not home, you see, and it's a very quiet neighborhood. And I've got nothing to say, but I have a microphone in my hand, and the camera is rolling, but I can tell you that I was here, and she's not home. Now, that was the reports we saw on that tragic incident that happened here.
That's right.
How many news reporters have gone out to stand in front of a highway and do a report with the cars whizzing by in the background, because this adds authenticity to what really is a worthless news item?
Exactly.
Again, back to the White House lawn, or standing in front of the county courthouse, or in front of the Supreme Court of the United States, or wherever you have to stand to say, yes, I was really there, and I really heard what they did.
Right. And I wonder how long it'll be before people tumble to the fact that the reason that they happen to see 2 minutes and 30 seconds of the Boy Scout camporee on such and such a channel tonight is because they happen to have 2 minutes and 30 seconds of film, and that was a good fill.
And it's a horrible thing to throw it away.
Yeah. Let's keep running it till it wears out.
Would anybody have the courage? You think anybody in the nation would have the courage to go on the air on television? We're not deliberately knocking television. This happens to be a potent force in American life. And the latest reports are that most people get the news throughout the day from radio, and invariably sit down in front of the evening news because they want to see what it looked like that you've been hearing about all day. Will we ever find someone in the United States who would have the courage to go on with a half-hour local newscast and just show it with somebody talking under it? Would they feel that they would lose the ratings, that they wouldn't have the entertainment value of their program? You think anybody's got that courage?
I have not found anyone.
How about the networks? When Huntley and Brinkley broke up, there was, all kinds of scrambling around. Who could ever replace Huntley and Brinkley? The only thing they offered, actually, at the time was a delivery, a style of delivery. The news is still being written by the same people who were writing it then.
That's right.
They're front men. Right.
And it has led to something which is even more insidious. And this is the thing where I think people have gotten the concept that there are all these people editorializing. In point of fact, there are an enormous amount of newsmen, an immense amount of my colleagues, fortunately not the majority, but too large a percentage, who believe they are the news. They believe they are it. That the news is kind of peripheral. The important thing is that Joe Blow appears tonight on television, and you can see him. And incidentally, he may, throw in a few bits of information.
Which is why I find the Mary Tyler Moore show such a fantastic show, because we understand Ted Knight
perfectly.
Ted Baxter on the program, and what Ted Baxter really represents, and he is more true to life than anybody wants to admit.
That's right.
And there are Ted Baxters in every city in the United States.
Absolutely.
Who know absolutely nothing about what they're reading, who are being very pretentious, and here is the news, blah. And you say that this is really where the criticism on editorializing or altering the news is.
Absolutely.
On these bodies that appear on the screen.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because you can't help but feel, here's a guy who's expensively dressed, faultlessly arrayed, and you look at him and you're sitting at home with your bottle of Schlitz, you know, in your underwear, and you think, here's this guy making all that money. And boy, he just better not say anything against anybody that I happen to be in favor of. That's what it adds up to, in effect. I believe that we never would have had this press problem of people thinking that the press is distorting and twisting news if this concept, this cult of the personality, had not come along. Now, I do realize that personality does develop in the news. For instance, I worked with many men in the earlier years who were personalities, but they were personalities because they were human beings, and in the process of becoming reporters over a period of years, they developed certain personal idiosyncrasies, which made them unique, like Elmer Davis, for instance, for whom I worked for quite some time. Now, this man really, actually, if you had heard him for the first time, you'd think he was a comic, because he had a voice, a strained voice like this, and even reading the most serious thing, he sounded like he was joking.
Let me jump in for a moment and say this is WIOD in Miami, and I'm going to forego reading the news at this moment because I don't dare in the center of this conversation.
Yeah, it would sound distorted.
Let me ask you about the weather. Do you think we are sick with the amount of time and value we give weather?
You mean on television? Or
on television.
Yeah, because it goes back to this thing again, you know, where the guy says, well, Joe Blow, are we going to get rain on the petunias? And with all this laughter and so on, this kills a little of the guy's time. So when he does get on with the weather, he says, well, we've been moving across the country today. There's a few low-pressure areas here and a little occlusion coming from the south.
Do you think the public cares about the isobars?
No, they couldn't. They couldn't. Now, if they're going to do this, they should separate it, you know, make a separate deal of it and say, once a week, an explanation of all the terms of the weather and why the isobars are important, why the low-pressure areas are important,
but
why the occlusions
we're spending
are
10
important.
minutes of local newscasts on weather.
And everybody's sitting there saying, come on, get to the forecast.
But what's important, is it going to rain tonight or not?
That's right. That's what everybody wants to know.
And in South Florida, it's a joke because it's always going to rain somewhere.
That's right. And if you notice, when they do get to that, you just get a brief flash of that weatherboard with the temperatures. And
why do they feel that the public is so intensely interested in what's happening in Oregon? Unless there happens to be a flood, of course. But that there's a stationary front, and there's a cold front moving down, and here are the satellite pictures, and here is the at-stills, and here is the at-moves, and this is the satellite pictures, and this is this. And do they really believe the public wants to know all this?
They must believe it.
They must believe it.
I can see one small reason. We have a very mobile population today, and there are people living in Florida who have just moved here from Portland, Oregon, we'll say, and they'd like to know.
People
what
are
it's
interested
like
from
Portland,
what's happening back home. I can understand that.
But to make this the big reason is somewhat nonsensical, you know. And since television and radio are so interested in sales, here's something they could sell. Why not do one forecast on television, which is just the forecast, nothing else, and then sell a separate program called Out-of-Town Weather. And this would be a separate deal, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, for those who are interested in that sort of thing. And go through it very methodically, and say, in Chicago today, the temperature was thus and so. They had rain starting at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and by 3:30, it had swept away the Woolworth building or something, All
right, Don, let's get to the heavy stuff.
Okay.
You grew up from the early days doing it the hard way, actually, by trial and error, and that's the hard way. You were a war correspondent in World War II. You worked on the networks. You've seen all aspects of news coverage. You've written for newspapers. The big question that's being asked, is the news being slanted?
No. Now, I'll tell you why it isn't being slanted. It's not being slanted for a very, very negative reason, for a very mediocre reason. It is not that newsmen are biased. It is that they are lazy. So therefore, the process now, in the course of the war, in addition, as a correspondent, I had to do some propaganda writing too, propaganda warfare type of thing. And I can testify from my own personal experience and from the experience of many, many others whom I've known, that the process of actually creating bias in the news, even the simplest kind of bias, is hard work. Very hard work. It's hard enough to write a story straight, but to write it with a purpose in mind of trying to plant a certain idea in people's minds takes a lot of skill and takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. And unfortunately, most newsmen I know have a tough enough time just making it through their day and getting in all the news that's supposed to be gotten in, let alone slanting it. They don't have the time. And they wouldn't even take the time if you asked them to take the time. If tomorrow the government issued an edict to newsmen and said, from this point forward, and by the way, Vice President Agnew wanted this, he wanted all newsmen registered. He wanted them licensed and controlled by the government so that they would report exactly. And incidentally, that brings up an interesting thing. I got this in his own words. And I carried the tape of this interview to a news directors convention in Denver, and it was confiscated by the FBI. That they did not want ever repeated.
Well, of course, that's another question. Are there controls being exercised upon the free exchange of news?
By the government?
Obviously, you had an experience in that line. Mm-hmm. All right.
Well, let's put it this way.
Is there too much news?
No, there's too little. There's too much time given to news, but there's too little news given in that time.
I see what you mean. Would it be better for us, for instance, to not be pounding the public with news every half hour, every 23 minutes, all day long, all night long, and have 1 or 2 or 3 definitive newscasts read by a news reader, as you might have on the BBC, who brings you all the facts with no coloring, but just facts?
No, I don't think so. For this reason, that in case, then, if we're gonna...
There was a time, you remember, when everybody tuned in, the 7 o'clock news.
Oh, yeah.
They didn't pay any attention to what was going on in the world until 7 o'clock.
That's right.
Then they got caught up on what was happening. They may have read the evening paper to see some of the background. And that was all the news you got. Mm-hmm. Now you get news and news and news and news. And people are complaining there's too much news.
And it's all the same news. It's repetitious. It's over and over and over, repeating the same stories.